Snow was falling heavily that night in the city. The clock had just struck 11:30 p.m. at Metro General Hospital, and the dedicated heart surgeon was finally wrapping up his incredibly long day. He'd been at the hospital since dawn, performing one critical surgery after another. His shoulders felt heavy, and his eyes were burning from exhaustion, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing he'd helped save 3 lives that day. The hospital corridors were quieter now, with just the soft squeaking of nurses' shoes and the distant beeping of medical equipment. As he packed up his things in his office, he could see the snowstorm intensifying through his window. The weather forecast had warned about this, one of the worst winter storms to hit the city in years. His office told its own story. Family photos shared space with medical certificates and thank you cards from grateful patients. One frame held a newspaper clipping about him being the youngest chief of cardiothoracic surgery in the hospital's history. But right now, all he could think about was getting home to his warm bed. Walking through the hospital parking lot, he pulled his coat tighter against the biting cold. The wind was merciless, whipping snow into his face as he hurried toward his car. The parking lot was almost empty, just a few vehicles belonging to the night shift staff scattered around. His breath came out in white puffs in the freezing air. The doctor's dark blue sedan was covered in a thin layer of snow. As he brushed it off, his hands grew numb despite his gloves. The city looked different at night, especially in the snow, quieter, almost peaceful. Street lamps cast a soft glow on the white-covered streets, and the usual city noise was muffled by the blanket of snow. Starting his car, he let it warm up for a few minutes while checking his phone. There was a message from his wife saying she'd left his favorite soup warming in the slow cooker. This small gesture brought a tired smile to his face. After such a long day, even simple comforts meant everything. The roads were treacherous with ice and snow, forcing him to drive slowly. Most sensible people were already home, leaving the streets nearly deserted. His usual 20-minute drive would probably take twice as long tonight. The radio quietly played jazz music as he carefully navigated the slippery streets, his headlights cutting through the swirling snow. He was about halfway home when he got the first warning sign that this night was about to become much longer. In his rearview mirror, he noticed a police car that had been following him for the last few blocks. He wasn't speeding, couldn't in this weather even if he wanted to, and his car registration was up to date. Still, something in his gut told him this wasn't going to be a normal drive home. The few other cars on the road passed by slowly, their headlights creating momentary streaks of brightness in the darkness. The police car continued to follow, staying a few car lengths behind. The doctor maintained his careful speed, both hands on the wheel, doing everything by the book. But his years of experience had taught him that sometimes doing everything right wasn't enough. Those blue and red lights he'd been dreading finally flashed to life, cutting through the snowy night with harsh brightness. The doctor felt his heart sink, even as he perfectly executed a proper traffic stop response, turning on his inside lights, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel, and pulling over slowly to a safe spot. As he waited for the officer to approach, he could see more snow starting to fall. The night was getting colder, and somehow he knew it was about to get much longer. His hospital ID hung visibly from his rearview mirror, and his white coat was still draped over the passenger seat. But something told him that tonight, these symbols of his profession might not carry their usual weight. The sound of boots crunching on snow grew closer, and the doctor took a deep breath, preparing himself for whatever was about to happen. The last thing he'd expected after saving lives all day was to end up in a situation like this. But here he was, about to face a challenge very different from the ones he'd handled in the operating room just hours before. The police officer's flashlight beam cut through the falling snow, sweeping across the car's interior before settling on the doctor's face. Despite the late hour and bitter cold, the officer took his time approaching the vehicle, his boots making deliberate crunching sounds in the fresh snow. The doctor kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, just as his father had taught him years ago. "Don't move." The officer's voice carried a threat that made the situation even more surreal. Here was a doctor needed for an emergency, being treated like a criminal on a snowy roadside. The phone continued to ring, each chime representing precious seconds ticking away for someone who might need immediate medical care. The emergency phone call continued to ring in the freezing night air. Each ring felt like a hammer striking the doctor's heart. Someone needed him, and here he was, unable to answer. "Officer, please," he said, his voice steady despite the cold. "That's the emergency line from my hospital. A patient could be dying." The officer's response was to shine his flashlight directly into the doctor's face. "I haven't finished my investigation," he said coldly, seemingly unbothered by the potentially life-or-death situation unfolding. The phone finally stopped ringing, leaving an awful silence broken only by the wind and the distant sound of traffic. Minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, it was accompanied by a text message alert. The doctor could see his phone screen lighting up from where it lay on his car seat. The message preview showed the words "emergency needed." His hands, numb from the cold, twitched with the instinct to reach for it. "Sir, I've spent the last 16 hours saving lives," the doctor explained, his breath visible in the freezing air. "My medical credentials are right there. You can call the hospital to verify my identity. Please just let me check my phone." His professional training helped him maintain his composure, but inside, his mind raced with thoughts of what emergency might be waiting. The officer walked over to the car, picked up the phone, and read the message aloud with an air of skepticism. "Emergency surgery needed. Cardiac patient in critical condition. How do I know this isn't some kind of code?" The absurdity of the suggestion would have been almost funny if the situation weren't so serious. Behind them, another car slowed down as it passed, its headlights illuminating the scene, a respected surgeon in scrubs, shivering in the snow while his medical equipment lay scattered on the ground. The doctor felt the sting of humiliation but held onto his dignity. He'd faced discrimination before, but never with a patient's life potentially hanging in the balance. The officer began questioning him about his role at the hospital, his tone dripping with disbelief. "So you expect me to believe you're a heart surgeon?" He picked up the doctor's hospital ID badge, examining it as if he expected to find it was fake. "These can be bought online, you know." The doctor's medical bag lay open in the snow, its contents getting wet and cold. Thousands of dollars worth of specialized equipment, tools he used to save lives, were being treated like suspicious evidence. His prescription pad had fallen into a puddle of slush, becoming soggy and unusable. The wind picked up, driving the snow harder against them. The doctor's scrubs, designed for the warm hospital environment, offered no protection against the elements. His fingers and toes had long since gone numb, and he'd lost count of how many times his phone had rung. Each unanswered call represented someone in need of his help. A passing ambulance's siren wailed in the distance, its sound carrying through the winter night. The doctor closed his eyes briefly, thinking of all the times he'd worked alongside emergency responders to save lives. Now, when seconds could mean the difference between life and death for someone, he was powerless to help. The officer continued his investigation, deliberately slow in his movements. He ran the doctor's license multiple times, called in for unnecessary background checks, and repeatedly questioned him about his route home from the hospital. Each question seemed designed to prolong the humiliation, to reinforce the message that in this moment, the doctor's credentials, education, and life-saving skills meant nothing. Another text message lit up the phone screen. This time, the officer read it with a smirk. "Doctor, patient critical, where are you?" The message's urgency only seemed to make him move more slowly, almost enjoying the power he held over the situation. The doctor thought about his patient from earlier that day, a young father who'd nearly died on his operating table but pulled through thanks to quick action and skill. The cold had become almost unbearable now. The doctor's feet were blocks of ice in his thin hospital shoes, and his hands shook uncontrollably. Still, he maintained his professional demeanor, answering each ridiculous question with patience, thinking of his father's words from years ago. "Your dignity is something no one can take from you unless you let them." Finally, another police car's lights appeared in the distance, responding to one of the officer's many radio calls. The doctor felt a mix of hope and dread. Would this second officer make things better or worse? As the new patrol car pulled up, the doctor silently prayed that this nightmare would end soon, thinking of the patient who needed him, hoping he wouldn't be too late. The second police car pulled up smoothly beside them, its headlights cutting through the swirling snow. The doctor watched as a female officer stepped out, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. Something about her presence immediately changed the atmosphere of the scene. She took one look at the doctor's medical equipment scattered in the snow, and her expression shifted to concern. "I know this doctor," she called out, walking briskly toward them. "He performed my father's bypass surgery 3 months ago." The first officer's demeanor changed slightly, though he tried to maintain his authoritative stance. The doctor remembered countless faces from his years of service, but right now he was more concerned about the patient waiting for him at the hospital. The phone rang again, the 5th emergency call in the last 30 minutes. This time, the female officer noticed the hospital's number on the screen. Without hesitation, she picked up the phone and answered professionally. "This is Officer Chen. Yes, the doctor is here. Yes, I understand the urgency." She listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each passing second. "There's a patient in critical condition," she announced, turning to her fellow officer. "The hospital needs their surgeon immediately." She quickly began gathering the doctor's scattered medical equipment, carefully placing each piece back in his bag. The first officer stood rigid, clearly unhappy with this interruption to his investigation. The doctor's hands were shaking so badly from the cold that he could barely hold his car keys. The female officer noticed and quickly turned up her patrol car's heater, letting him warm up while she documented the scene. She photographed his medical equipment in the snow, the multiple incoming emergency calls, and most importantly, the timestamps of how long he'd been detained. "Your patient needs you," she said firmly, handling the situation with the first officer herself. "I'll make sure everything here is properly documented." The doctor didn't need to be told twice. His mind was already racing ahead to the emergency waiting at the hospital, mentally preparing for whatever surgery would be needed. As he started his car, the heat finally beginning to thaw his frozen fingers, he could hear the female officer's stern voice addressing her colleague. "That's the head of cardiothoracic surgery at Metro General. Do you understand what you've done here?" Her words faded as he carefully pulled away from the curb, but their impact hung in the air. The drive to the hospital was tense. Every second counted now, and the doctor's mind raced with possibilities about the patient's condition. Had the delay caused irreparable damage? Could they have lost precious time that might cost someone their life? He pushed these thoughts aside, focusing instead on what he could control, getting to the hospital safely and quickly. The emergency room entrance was blazing with light when he arrived, the trauma team already assembled and waiting. As he hurried inside, his partially frozen medical equipment clutched in his hands. A nurse rushed forward with updates about the patient. It was a complex case, exactly the kind of surgery he specialized in. Despite his numbed hands and the lingering chill in his bones, the doctor moved with practiced efficiency. He'd learned long ago that personal discomfort had to take a backseat to patient care. As he scrubbed in for surgery, the warm water slowly bringing feeling back to his fingers, he pushed aside all thoughts of what had just happened on that snowy roadside. The operating room was ready, its bright lights and steady beeping of monitors a familiar comfort after the chaos outside. The patient needed him now, needed his focus, his skill, and his years of experience. The officer's prejudice and abuse of power would have to wait. Right now, there was a life to save. As he stepped up to the operating table, the doctor felt the same calm focus that had carried him through countless surgeries before. The night's humiliation and cold melted away, replaced by the absolute concentration required for the delicate procedure ahead. His team looked to him with trust and respect. The kind of respect earned through years of dedicated service and countless lives saved. The surgery would be challenging, made more so by his still thawing hands and the precious time lost. But as he made the first incision, the doctor knew that this too would become part of his story, not just of perseverance in the face of prejudice, but of maintaining professional dignity when it mattered most. Someone's life depended on him rising above what had happened, and that's exactly what he intended to do. The surgery lasted for nearly 5 hours, pushing the doctor's already exhausted body to its limits. Every movement had to be precise, every decision crucial. The patient, a young mother of 2, had needed every second of his expertise. As he made the final suture, the relief in the operating room was palpable. They'd done it. Despite everything that had happened that night, another life had been saved. Coming out of the operating room, the doctor found the female officer waiting in the hospital corridor. She'd stayed well past her shift, understanding the significance of what had happened. "I've documented everything," she said quietly, holding up a thick folder. "The dashcam footage, the timestamps, the emergency calls, it's all here. What happened to you tonight wasn't right." The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the hospital windows, casting long shadows in the quiet hallways. The doctor's hands still held a slight tremor, not from the cold now, but from the pure exhaustion of working nearly 24 hours straight. A nurse brought him a cup of hot coffee, her eyes showing both concern and respect. "The patient's family is waiting to thank you," another nurse mentioned softly. "They don't know what delayed you, but they're just grateful you made it." The doctor nodded, taking a moment to collect himself. He'd tell them another time, perhaps, about the obstacles he'd faced to be there for their loved one. Right now, their relief and gratitude were all that mattered. The female officer shared more details about her documentation. She'd been thorough, professional, and most importantly, honest. "There's a pattern here," she explained, showing him a carefully organized file. "Other medical professionals have faced similar treatment from this officer, but no one's had enough evidence to prove it. Until now." The hospital's chief of staff arrived early that morning, having heard about the incident. His face showed a mix of anger and determination as he reviewed the evidence. "This ends now," he stated firmly. "Our doctors save lives every day. They deserve respect, not harassment. The hospital's legal team will back you fully on this." News of what had happened spread quickly through the hospital staff. Other doctors and nurses came forward with their own stories, similar experiences they'd faced but hadn't reported, thinking nothing would change. The doctor realized his experience could be a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone who'd faced such discrimination. The female officer had also gathered statements from witnesses, other drivers who'd passed by and seen a medical professional being held in the snow. Some had even taken photos, disturbed by what they'd seen. Each piece of evidence added strength to what was becoming an undeniable case of misconduct. Later that morning, sitting in his office, the doctor looked at the family photos on his desk. His children's smiling faces reminded him why this fight was important. It wasn't just about one night or one incident. It was about the kind of world they would grow up in, the kind of changes he could help make happen. The hospital's security cameras had captured his arrival after the incident, his medical equipment dripping wet, his scrubs still covered in snow, his hands shaking from the cold. But they'd also captured what happened next, his immediate focus on saving his patient, putting aside personal discomfort and humiliation to do what he'd sworn to do as a doctor. The legal team arrived mid-morning, ready to take action. They weren't just looking at filing a complaint, they saw an opportunity to push for systemic change. "Your case is strong," the lead lawyer explained. "We have evidence, witnesses, and most importantly, we have proof of how this misconduct directly endangered a patient's life." As the doctor finally prepared to head home, nearly 30 hours after his shift had first begun, he felt a strange mix of emotions. There was exhaustion, certainly, and lingering anger at the injustice he faced. But there was also hope. The support he'd received from the female officer, the hospital staff, his colleagues, and even strangers who'd witnessed the incident, showed him that change was possible. His wife had called several times, worried about why he hadn't come home. Now, as he gathered his things to leave, he thought about how to tell her what had happened. He would share everything: the humiliation, the cold, the fear for his patient's life, but also the strength he found and the support he'd received. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. The next few days unfolded with purpose and determination. The doctor took careful, measured steps to address what had happened that snowy night. His first action wasn't driven by anger, but by a deep understanding that this was about more than just one incident. It was about preventing it from happening to others. The hospital's legal team set up their first meeting in a quiet conference room away from the busy hospital corridors. They spread out all the evidence on the large table: the female officer's detailed report, photographs of medical equipment thrown in the snow, timestamps of the emergency calls, and the dashcam footage that captured everything. The doctor watched the video for the first time, seeing himself standing in the freezing cold while his car was needlessly searched. "Your patient could have died," one of the lawyers said quietly, reviewing the timeline. "The delay in emergency care due to this unlawful detention is the kind of thing that changes policies." They worked together to draft a formal complaint that was precise and professional, focusing on facts rather than emotions. Each point was backed by evidence, each claim supported by documentation. The doctor's colleagues came forward one by one, sharing their own experiences. A nurse recalled seeing him arrive that night, his hands so cold he could barely hold his surgical instruments. The operating room staff testified about how he pushed through exhaustion and physical discomfort to save his patient's life. Their statements added weight to the case, showing the real-world impact of what had happened. The police department's internal affairs division took notice. This wasn't just another complaint. This was a respected surgeon with an impeccable record, backed by hospital administration, with clear evidence of misconduct that had put a life at risk. The female officer who'd helped that night continued to support the case, providing additional context about departmental procedures that had been violated. Meanwhile, the doctor maintained his regular surgical schedule, saving lives and caring for patients. He didn't let the ongoing investigation distract him from his calling. If anything, the experience had reinforced his commitment to his profession. Each successful surgery, each life saved, was a quiet reminder of why he'd chosen this path and why fighting for change mattered. The local medical board became involved, expressing serious concerns about the incident. They pointed out that interfering with a doctor's response to an emergency call wasn't just harassment, it was a dangerous obstruction of medical care. Their official statement added another layer of credibility to the case, showing that this wasn't just about one doctor's experience, but about public safety. Community leaders reached out, offering support and sharing similar stories from their own experiences. The doctor listened to each one, understanding that his case could be a catalyst for broader change. He began working with them to develop programs that would build better understanding between law enforcement and medical professionals. The hospital administration took steps too, implementing new protocols for emergency situations. They created special identification cards for their medical staff and established direct lines of communication with local law enforcement. These practical changes would help prevent similar incidents in the future, protecting both healthcare workers and their patients. News of the case spread through professional channels, catching the attention of medical associations across the country. They saw it as an important precedent, how a doctor had used proper channels and professional resources to address discrimination, rather than letting anger or frustration guide his actions. The doctor's wife supported him through it all, understanding the importance of what he was doing. Their children watched too, learning a powerful lesson about standing up for what's right while maintaining dignity and professionalism. At dinner each night, they talked about the progress being made, about how change happens one step at a time. As the investigation proceeded, more evidence emerged about the officer's past behavior. Other incidents came to light, showing a pattern that couldn't be ignored. The doctor's case wasn't just about one night anymore. It had become the key to addressing a deeper systemic problem that had gone unchecked for too long. The doctor kept the young mother's thank you card on his desk, the patient he'd saved that night despite all the obstacles. Her words reminded him daily of why he'd chosen to fight this battle the right way, through proper channels and professional means. This wasn't just about seeking justice, it was about making sure that when the next emergency call came, no doctor would have to choose between their dignity and their duty. 3 months after that cold winter night, change began to take real shape. The police department's internal investigation had concluded, and the results were clear and decisive. The officer who had detained the doctor was suspended without pay, pending a formal review of his conduct. But more importantly, the incident had sparked meaningful reforms that would have lasting effects. The doctor sat in his office, reading through the official findings. His desk, once covered with legal documents and evidence files, now held something different: plans for a new community program. Working together with the female officer who'd helped him that night, he'd developed training sessions that brought medical professionals and law enforcement officers together to build understanding and trust. The first training session was held in the hospital's main conference room. Police officers sat alongside doctors, nurses, and paramedics, sharing experiences and learning from each other. The doctor shared his story, not with anger, but as a teaching moment. He talked about the lives at stake when medical professionals are delayed from doing their jobs, and about the importance of mutual respect. His patient, the young mother whose life hung in the balance that night, had fully recovered and became an unexpected advocate for change. She spoke at community meetings about how close she'd come to leaving her children without a mother, all because her surgeon had been needlessly detained. Her words carried powerful weight, putting a human face on the consequences of discrimination. The hospital had implemented new protocols, creating emergency passes for all medical staff that were officially recognized by local law enforcement. These simple cards, backed by both the hospital and police department, would prevent future incidents during emergency calls. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest steps. Other hospitals across the state began adopting similar programs. The doctor's case had become a template for how to address discrimination professionally and effectively. Medical schools added new training modules about dealing with prejudice while maintaining professional standards. His story was teaching the next generation of doctors that they could fight injustice without compromising their principles. The police department underwent its own transformation. New mandatory training sessions focused on interactions with medical professionals and understanding the critical nature of emergency medical responses. The female officer who'd helped that night was promoted to lead these training sessions, using her experience to shape better policies. Community support had grown beyond anything the doctor could have imagined. Local organizations worked together to create a citizens' oversight committee, ensuring that both medical professionals and law enforcement officers could do their jobs without fear or prejudice. The doctor's calm, professional approach to seeking justice has shown everyone a better way forward. 1 year after the incident, the doctor stood at a podium, addressing a graduating class of medical students. He shared his story not as a tale of victimhood, but as an example of how maintaining professionalism in the face of prejudice could lead to positive change. The students listened intently, understanding that their white coats carried both privilege and responsibility. The officer who'd caused all this had been dismissed from the force, but that wasn't the end of the story. The evidence from the doctor's case had led to a review of past incidents, bringing justice to others who'd faced similar discrimination. Sometimes it takes one well-documented case to expose a pattern that affects many. The doctor's children had watched their father through all of this, learning valuable lessons about dignity, perseverance, and the power of doing things the right way. At dinner one evening, his youngest asked him if he was still angry about what happened. The doctor thought carefully before answering, "No, I'm hopeful, because now things are changing." That hope wasn't just words. Real changes were happening. Emergency response times had improved now that medical professionals could travel without fear of unnecessary delays. Relations between the hospital and police department had strengthened. The community felt safer knowing that those who save lives and those who protect them were working together. Looking back, the doctor realized that what started as a humiliating experience in the snow had become something much more meaningful. It wasn't just about one doctor or one officer, it was about building a better system for everyone. His professional response to injustice had created ripples of positive change that would continue long after that cold winter night had faded into memory.